Hi. We move today into what is potentially the most consequential chapter in the entire Hebrew Bible. The movement of the Israelites from some kind of loose-knit tribal confederacy to being a monarchy, quote-unquote, like the other nations. And so although we're only going to cover 9 verses of this chapter today, there's so much going on that who knows how long this video would be, and it could go on for hours, and I promise you not to do that. But there are 2 major issues. One is where chapter 8 fits in the narrative, both in terms of what we've seen in the chapters that preceded, that we decided were most likely exilic chapters reflecting on the failure of monarchy after the fact. So as we get into the chapters that announce the ambiguity of monarchy, we certainly think those are coming from a little later place. But they're also not celebrating the monarchy directly, as we'll see both celebration briefly of Saul's reign, but obviously the long-term celebration and promises made to David and his successors in 2 Samuel 7, the covenant given from Yahweh forever, that one of his descendants would be on this throne as God's will. So that's one set of issues we have to look at, is how do these chapters 8, 9, and a couple that follow it fit in with what we just saw before with the Yahweh alone emphasis and what follows with the acceptance of monarchy. But we also have to look beyond this chapter to see how this fit into the wider context, not only of the various biblical texts that we can imagine or might know at some level were written before the story of the monarchy, but also how this relates to the cultures of the people around them. Because so many things about this are shocking, both in terms of how it fits in the narrative, but also in terms of how it fits in the self-understanding of Israel's relationship with Yahweh, that we have to take a closer look. So what I'd like to do to start with is not look at my notes for it, but to put on the screen a few quotes from some scholars that I think help us to enter into this section. First, here from David Jobling. He says, 1 Samuel 8-12 adopts 2 strategies. On the one hand, it presents the coming of kingship as a bad thing and lays blame for it. On the other hand, it suggests that kingship is not necessarily a bad thing, that it can be incorporated into the logic of judgeship. These strategies are incompatible, and narrative work, as we anticipated, is intensely problematic. The great Walter Brueggemann says simply about this chapter, the question of this chapter is how to order public power and how to guard public well-being in a community where the leadership tends to pervert that power and well-being. And so we also hear here from Samura, who we've seen mostly as a philological help. He's very good about the language and structure of the words, and he hasn't commented that much on the social implications. But here he has this to say. As seen in chapter 7, the pre-monarchical institution of kingship was completely adequate and even ideal for the covenant people. So their insistence upon changing to a new system was a strange denial of this plain fact. So then we'll go to Halberstam and Holmes, who we've looked at before. Here's their book, so that we can hear something that they say as a lawyer and historian about what set up the crisis that we see in chapter 8. So they note this. In the political theology typical of the great land powers surrounding ancient Israel, which is to say Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, the king was either a god, an incarnation of a god, or a semi-mythic human king who was elected by the gods. Kingship was not generally perceived as a historical institution that was consciously chosen at a certain critical moment in time out of the imperatives of communal life. Elsewhere, for the most part, monarchy was understood as part of the permanent furniture of the cosmos itself. The biblical political theology that preceded the dramatic events recounted in the Book of Samuel upended this ancient Near Eastern formula. Rather than declaring that the king is a god, the new theology postulated instead that God is the king. And of course, that's what we've been seeing in the last few chapters. Yahweh alone, and we'll see explicitly in this chapter when Yahweh says to the peeved Samuel, it's not you they've rejected, but me they've rejected as being king over them, that we had not otherwise specifically known that Yahweh was king over them. Certainly many scholars have analyzed the covenant stories in Exodus as parallel to the stories of a king making an offer to a people to be their king and such. But Yahweh is not called a king there, although in Exodus 19:6 we hear that they would be a royal people, so that's certainly implying that. But the idea, whether it's written in earlier text, quote-unquote earlier text, earlier in the sequence, but not necessarily earlier in the order of writing, like Exodus, still makes the injection first of God as a king as a shocking reality. But that's the given we've been looking at. Now a new shocking reality comes in. A human king who's not a god will be appointed as king. In other words, a regular, ordinary person will somehow be elevated to be what in other cultures was a person who is somehow only sort of a person. And we can see that so easily in texts like Psalm 2. Let's just go to it here so we can see it on our screen. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth a possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. And that last verse 9 there of Psalm 2 is something we hear echoed in the book of Revelation, but that's literally for a different series in our program here. So what we can hear in that, as you see, especially before I go back to 1 Samuel in verse 7, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. God's king is a son of God. So it's not like unique to Jesus as in a later Trinitarian Christian ontological reading of that, like Jesus' sonship is something structured into the universe, but rather the sonship is something given by God as king, at least here in Psalm 2. We won't get into Christological implications now. It's just to highlight that the image of a son of God, which was also common in the Roman world much later than our world in Samuel, but not different than the world of Jesus, of course, that a human king like Augustus was the son of Julius and therefore was a king, son of God. As we go back to our chapter here in chapter 8, the notion that got accepted in places like Psalm 2 and obviously throughout the monarchy, that Yahweh had appointed a human being as king and therefore declared that person God's son, was a brand new thing. It doesn't emerge for the first time here, though. We have to pay some attention to the places where it seems to have risen earlier. Earlier meaning in texts that we know came earlier, like Judges. Certainly Judges, as we've seen so many of the connections here with Samuel, so if not earlier, at least from the same time. So we see back in Judges 8, 22 and 23 this, after Gideon has successfully led them in victory, we hear, then the Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us out of the hand of Midian. And Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. Yahweh will rule over you. And then in the very next chapter, we won't look at it now, ironically named Abimelech, father of a king, tells us a little parable, not marked as a parable, about a series of trees that refuse to be ruled over until it gets to brambles, and that refers to Abimelech in the telling of another character in the story. Abimelech is said to rule over as king, but it's not monarchy, really. It's just a local situation. But it was there in the air, so to speak, that somebody who led them in victory would, therefore, could become a permanent ruler and pass it on through his children, as opposed to the judges they'd seen, and we'll see after that, where they simply are drawn up by the Spirit of Yahweh and then disappear once that situation is over. So that's a couple aspects of that certainly happened before that put the question in mind. Also before that, in the sense of the sequence we read, is the Book of Deuteronomy. But by all accounts, and we've already looked at this some, Deuteronomy and Joshua are probably from the late monarchy period, at least the original form of them, from the time of Josiah, probably around 620, in a last-ditch attempt to pull together the remnant of Israel and Judah into a nation and give them a sort of a new constitution in the form of Deuteronomy and a new story of origins with the Book of Joshua. So the question of kings in Deuteronomy is almost certainly later, but not exilic. So let's listen to the details of that so we can hear that it both refers to the story we're looking at here, but also provides a different framing of it that we're going to see in 1 Samuel 8. So this is from Deuteronomy 17, 14 to 20. When you have come into the land that Yahweh your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you, whom Yahweh your God will choose. One of your own community you may set as king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you, who is not of your own community. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since Yahweh has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall remain with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear Yahweh his God, diligently observing all the words of this law and these statutes, neither exalting himself above other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandment, either to the right or to the left, so that he and his descendants may reign long over his kingdom in Israel. So, a lot of detail there, and we're not going to go into that now, but two things to note about that. One is that in accordance with traditional monarchy in Israel and Judah or elsewhere, this is an anti-king. What is a king who's not raised up above the community, who doesn't have horses, who doesn't have wives, who doesn't have gold or silver, and is simply trying to follow the law of a god? So it would be a very different kind of kingship. And it's pretty much a blueprint for not Solomon, which would make sense that if it comes from the time of Josiah, the compromise would be from the people of the north returning to Jerusalem in the crisis they were facing of the coming Babylonians. Well, we're not going to allow a king that is so exploitive that as soon as he's dead, the people of Israel go to his son and say, your father was harsh on us. And the harshness thus is defined by his greed and his selfishness and his many wives, that ultimately in 1 Kings 11 is said to be the cause of why he lost the kingdom, because his wives worshiping foreign gods led them astray. We'll put aside the women blaming part of the story for now, and we'll come back to it later, I assure you. But for now, it's just to highlight this is a later reflection on the possibility of having a monarchy that was a different kind of monarchy. But that's much later, almost to the end of it. So we have to look at our chapter 8 here as just breaking in to put the question before us. And two more things as we jump into this quickly. One is, as we'll see narratively, it comes out of nowhere. If we didn't know that 1 Samuel was the beginning of a story about the monarchy, nothing in what we've seen so far suggests that immediately after Samuel had given them a prophetic Deuteronomistic speech about repenting of their worship of foreign gods and coming back to Yahweh, that they would say, we want a king. The other aspect of it is, we will see, not so much in this video, but in the next one and the one that follows, if not exactly a debate like the Federalist Papers, at least the text showing the pros and cons. And showing that the people have a choice, that it's not God imposing this on them, it's not built into the cosmos like in Enuma Elish or in the Egyptian stories, that their king embodied Ra, but something that people are simply choosing and are warned in advance of what the consequences of that will be, which we'll see next time. So let's just jump into our story and briefly look at these verses, because some of the main part will come next time. So when Samuel became old, old here is suggesting that obviously that he's near the end of his career, but it also puts him in association with Eli, as we see there down below, where zakan, the word for old, has only been used for Eli twice before, and twice in this little section for Samuel, and then once more when he gives a speech in chapter 12. The only other people named as old, the entire books of Samuel, is Barzillai, one of the elderly David's advisors, and David himself isn't said to be old until the very beginning of 1 Kings. So oldness here is symbolizing some question of transition. And Samuel realizes it, and he made his sons judges over Israel. And as my note down below from Jobling says, I think right on the spot, the greatest of judges at the moment of triumph for him and his office so far forgets the nature of judgeship as to try to make it hereditary. Like, what is going on with Samuel that he would suddenly recognize that what didn't work for Eli and had never worked for any of the judges, had never been tried, would work for him? But he made them judges here, and this introduces Shaphat here in the form of Shaphatim, plural judges, and you see 8:1, 8:2, 8:5, 8:6, so 4 times in 6 verses, and then in verse 20. So the theme here is justice, and whether justice can come from a king is one of the key questions. So we see the name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. Where's his wife? We never hear of a wife for Samuel. He has sons and apparently no wife. There's several firstborns we'll see. You see them down below. Firstborn of David's father Jesse, and then the firstborn of David himself, and none of those turn out to be inheriting. So it plays into the story of Jacob and Esau, where again the firstborn Esau doesn't get any advantage there. But throughout this whole section, the firstborns have nothing to say that gives them any benefit. So we have Joel, whose name is Yah, who is God, and Abijah, whose name my father is Yah. So they've got good Yahwist names, and they were judges in Beersheba, which is way in the south. And you'd wonder why, if Samuel's headquarters and home is in Ramah, and we saw last time the little circuit he was making around the local towns. Beersheba is way south on the edge of the desert, and so why would they be going down there? The name means 7 wells, which is, say, little oases that protect from the otherwise threatening desert. So we don't know any reason for that, and it doesn't really matter, because we see immediately his sons did not follow in his ways. Notice not Yahweh's ways, but his ways. We can assume that Samuel's ways are Yahweh's ways, but are they? We'll see throughout the next couple of chapters. Maybe, maybe not. So, like Eli's sons turned aside after gain, they took bribes and perverted justice. And of course, the phrase for taking the prohibition against taking bribes is a very Deuteronomistic thing. We see it here from Deuteronomy 16 and 19. You must not distort justice. You must not show partiality. You must not accept bribes, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. So they obviously are violating the Deuteronomic law, which in the story world they don't know, but obviously the audience world is very familiar with Deuteronomy. He names his sons to be judges, and they pervert justice, and so we're seeing it again here. Then all the elders of Israel gathered, and Samuel had previously spoken to all Israel, and as Walter Brueggemann importantly notes here, the ones who are most vulnerable to the new economic and political arrangements are characteristically not present in the discussion, because as we'll see next time, and later in the chapter, what the king will do will exploit everybody else other than the elders and the elite, and so they have nothing to say here. It's simply the elders who gather, and they come to Samuel at Ramah at his headquarters. Presumably his sons Joel and Abijah are still down in Beersheba. We don't see them again. So they say to him, you are old, and so it's now echoing the narrator here. And it's the second time we're hearing that. And your sons do not follow in your ways. So far, so much from the narrator. But then we hear this, appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations. And we need to look closely at all three parts of that. Appoint for us, literally, sema here means to set. And that's important because it's a different word than what Samuel repeats in the next verse. So set us a king, put a king in its place. To govern us is to judge us. Leshapatanu here, to judge us. And as my own note says, this is an oxymoron here. The king to judge us. We saw that Samuel had been described by the narrator as judging when he was actually engaging in more like prophetic denunciation of their idolatry and calling them back to an implicit covenant, never named as such, but certainly calling them back to the ways of Yahweh given after their time in Egypt, which implies the covenant. And so a king to govern us, maybe not a prophet, or to judge us rather, not a prophet to judge us, but a king to judge us like other nations. And of course, this violates the premier Deuteronomistic call that we hear in Deuteronomy 7:6, as you see here. For you are a people holy to Yahweh your God. Yahweh your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on earth to be his people, his treasured possession. A classic statement of the chosen people formula. And while that can be played out against the idea that being chosen makes you arrogant, unlike the Genesis admonition that all people are made in the image and likeness of God. Here it's the flip side. It's chosen to be special, to be a witness that one doesn't have to be subservient to human monarchs who claim to be God according to their false gods, but you can be different and worship the only real God, the Creator God. But they're unwilling to do it. They want to be like other nations. In other words, we quit on the task that we've been given to be a chosen people. And the thing displeased Samuel, and scholars have gone through all kinds of wonderful and engaging back and forths over Samuel's upset here of what he's exactly upset about. As you see from my note below, Samuel deeply resents the people's demand that he exercises authority to demote or even remove himself by appointing another leader, a king, especially one who will govern or judge the people as he's been doing. So that's one point of view, that he sees himself as being replaced. Or is it a pure voice on behalf of the covenant, and as a prophet would be, upset that the people are disowning Yahweh? But as we'll see, Yahweh says, Yahweh interprets it that it's about Samuel, and that's not the right answer. So we'll see. The scholars are not just guessing when they suggest that Samuel is personally peeved here. But what we hear also, the narrator says the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king. But that's not what we heard them say. So implicitly, that's what we're hearing from the narrator, that Samuel heard them say is something they should be given. And there's a great irony in that, because as we'll see, what Samuel tells the people is what the king will do is take, 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 take. But what they said was, set us a king. Put one in place for us, not give us one. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and this is the second to the last time he'll pray. It'll again be in 12:19. This is his last opportunity to intercede on behalf of the people. And so we get to the end of the section we're going to do now with verse 7, 8, and 9. And Yahweh said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people. And the irony of that is tremendous, of course, because we know that from Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema, the most central prayer of all Israel, is, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And as you can see from my note below, that hear, O Israel is not only in what we call the Shema, which simply means listen or obey, in 6:4, but also Deuteronomy 4:1, 5:1, etc. But it's never after 15:1 in 1 Samuel, and never in 2 Samuel. The call to listen to Yahweh will have ended in chapter 15. So here, Yahweh says to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people, the exact flip side in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you here, and notice it's twice here, but have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, which to say, was God king over them then? Again, it wasn't explicit, but that was the implicit sense of the covenant that I was suggesting earlier here. And as Jobling says down below, hearing his own words from Deuteronomy 17:14 spoken back to him by the people, Yahweh himself borrows Gideon's words from Judges 8:23. And of course, Jobling's having some fun with that. He knows well that Deuteronomy is probably written earlier, but as we read it in a continuous narrative, that's how it sounds. And so we get the other reference here from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Even though we saw in the very last chapter they forswore serving other gods. That's exactly what Samuel had done in chapter 7, was to get them to forswear serving other gods. And they're asking Yahweh about the king, or asking Samuel about the king, but presumably via Yahweh, certainly not via Baal or the Astartes. And so it's only Yahweh who recognizes the reality of what's going on here. So then finally, now listen to their voice, repeat it again, only you shall solemnly warn them. And this is also an echo, in this case not from Deuteronomy, but from the very Deuteronomistic prophet Jeremiah, as we hear here from Jeremiah 11:7. For I solemnly warned your ancestors when I brought them up out of the land of Egypt, warning them persistently, even to this day, saying, listen to my voice. And so that phrase here in the doubled form that we see in the notes, but when the Hebrew verb is repeated twice, is the form of solemnly here. Warn, yes, warn, and show them, or here more specifically, announce to them, not the ways of the king, but the justice of the king, the mishpat hamelech, the justice of the king. So ways is completely bad translation there, because this whole section we saw is about justice. Show them the justice of the king, who will reign over them. Will not be their judge, will be over them. So they're asking to have somebody appointed by God who will be hierarchically above them, and they're being told what it will be like, and we'll see that next time, but we already know the answer. They will say, no, give us a king. All right, we'll continue with that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.